Thank you. It's good to be here. I've never been at the fabled Burton Academy, and now I know what it looks like. I have to start off with a confession. I'm going to throw some statistics at you. And I got most of these statistics from charts and graphs. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll do PowerPoint. And then it'll liven things up, and you'll be able to see the statistics, the charts and graphs there. And now I had never done PowerPoint. But I thought, how hard can it be to learn how to do PowerPoint? Too hard, as it turns out. Too hard for me. So I'm going to have to be lively enough, or it won't be lively. So this is you're just going to have to put up with me talking. I also realized I'd have a decision to make at the outset because of the title that I chose. The title is as you know, is Vermont Going Broke? I know the answer. So the question is, should I reveal it right away or should I prolong the suspense? I think I'm going to prolong the suspense, but I reserve the right to break it at any moment. Now, those of you who even slightly followed the doings of the recently concluded legislative session know that the state government is almost broke. But you know what? All state governments are always almost broke. That's because governors and legislators don't like to raise taxes because taxpayers don't like to pay higher taxes. And guess what? Taxpayers are voters. So there's a great disincentive to raise taxes, whereas the costs and the needs of state government keep going up and up, which are maybe, if we have time, I'll get to toward the end. There are some reasons why they keep going up beyond just the normal growth of everything. This year, there was a story in the paper yesterday in the New York Times. Half the states have not adopted budgets, and the deadline is passed. In almost every state, the law, sometimes the Constitution says the legislature must pass a budget by April 1st or May 1st, or at the latest June 1st. 25 states have not passed budgets. We have, and Vermont came in on time. The inspiration for my title was curiosity, that I've sort of a growing curiosity about a visible and very audible and I think unusual phenomenon in Vermont, which is we have a small but devoted core of Vermonters who work hard at trashing the place. Now this is, every state has its dissenters and protesters who complain about one aspect or another of the state's policies, laws, budgets, maybe even the culture. But I think in very few other states is there the same kind of anti-promotion core. A self-selected army of writers, they write letters to the editor and columns, a lot of these my turn columns that anybody can write in the Burlington Free Press. They don't get paid for it. The columns are usually worth every penny that the writers get paid. But people write, they get things off there. They don't necessarily know what they're talking about, but that's not a requirement. All you have to do is write it, and the Free Press will run it. But how many people read? We're away from Burlington. Anybody here read the Burlington Free Press? It is the biggest newspaper in the state. Okay, more and more, they're getting other people, like their readers, to write for the paper, because otherwise they have to actually pay staff. And what modern newspapers hate to do, especially those owned by the Gannett Company, such as the Free Press, is pay anyone an actual salary and, worse, benefits. The reason that the Burlington Free Press exists, I think, is to suppress wages and benefits. So they have this thing called, you pick it up, it's very pretty, they have a thing called Vermont Beauty. They want people to send in photographs, and they'll run them. They won't pay for them. Anyway, I'm digressing. I tend to digress sometimes. We have a steady stream of letter writers and column writers who bemoan the state of the state. A lot of this comes from business people, which is really unusual because businessmen and women usually are boosters. In fact, it's business people who complain about news stories that reveal some problem. Pollution in the stream, more homelessness in the county, a wave of burglaries, somebody from the Chamber of Commerce or maybe a local store owner or auto dealer will call the editor and say, don't write those stories, it's bad for business. Well, you'd think that it would also be bad for business to keep decrying the state of your own state's economy, but we have a fair number of people who do that fairly regularly. I'm not really sure whether we have more of it than other states. It may be that it's just more noticeable here. And that could be because most of it comes from sort of the right side of the political spectrum, and we don't have much else of a right side of a political spectrum in Vermont. We have a pro-business center-right, which is very articulate and is sometimes goes as far as these folks who say Vermont is going broke, Vermont is going to hell in a handbasket. But usually they don't say that. They may have their complaints, but they don't quite go that far. We don't have, the Christian right is all but absent in Vermont. There's not much opposition to legal abortions or same-sex marriage, and we really don't have much of a global warming denial community. But we do have a very vocal faction convinced that Vermont is going to hell in a handbasket, and these people do get some attention. A few months ago, one of those My Turn columns in the Burlington Free Press opened with the words, "Small business passed away today in the state of Vermont." Now, I don't know, I live in the Northeast Kingdom. Coming down here, I stopped at 2 small businesses to get a cup of coffee, buy some gasoline, etc. They seem to be thriving, but I'm not arguing with this guy. In a letter to the editor to the Free Press not long ago, a reader from Stowe warned that Vermont is in danger of emulating France, where government policies have, and I quote, driven employment into neighboring countries to the extent that France's economy is now in desperate straits. Quel horror! Or actually, maybe not. If you just look at the data, French people live rather well, better than most other people. When these people talk about Vermont going broke, they don't mean state government. They mean the state, its economy, its society, even perhaps its existence, because a common phrase in their writings is some variant of the old line about, will the last person to leave Vermont please turn out the lights? As if in the not too distant future, everyone will leave, or at least everyone who can leave will leave. I've got news for them and for you. That already happened. From the 1880s to the 1960s, Vermont's population did not grow. In 2 of those decades, the 1920s and 40s, it fell. Births outnumbered deaths at a normal clip, but almost nobody moved into Vermont, and thousands of people moved out, and the people who moved out very often were the most inventive, most adventurous, most capable people who saw that they had no future in Vermont. And one of the things Vermont did for almost a century was contribute all sorts of smart people to the rest of the country. It was our major export. From 1960 until 2000, the population grew just fine. Now it's leveled off again. This might, in fact, indicate some underlying problem in the state, or maybe not. I'll get to that in just a minute. Anyway, thanks to this steady stream of gloom and doom prediction, I decided to take a look and see what ailed Vermont, to see whether we were in fact being propelled toward the abyss. And we do have some major problems in Vermont, and almost all of them, not all of them, but almost all of them have one simple cause. Vermont is in the United States of America. That is our big problem. I don't know if you've noticed, but things are not so great in America, just looking at the economy. Better than they were a couple of years ago, but the economy is growing at the rate of about 2% a year. That's not good. Coming out of a big recession, it's even less than not good. It's rather poor. So yes, Vermont's economy is growing slowly. So are the economies of all of its neighbors, and in fact of every state in the Northeast. To find a higher rate of GDP growth, here I wish I had the PowerPoint, you have to go as far west as Michigan, which is perking up because the auto industry is rebounding, or as far south as West Virginia. That's coal. I don't think too many of us want to change places with West Virginia. Since the depth of the recession in '09, Vermont's GDP has grown at an annual rate of 2.4%. The nation grew 2.0% in that same time. And we're creating jobs at a faster rate. In April, 310,700 Vermonters were working. From the previous April, the private sector, just the private sector, had added 6,200 jobs. During that year, earnings, adjusted for inflation, there's no inflation now, so that's a minor adjustment, but adjusted for inflation, grew by 4.4%, substantially higher than the national rate of 2.3%. Doesn't sound like we're going broke, but wait a minute, we have some problems to look at. So let's look at some of those worrying indicators that many people point to as they argue that Vermont is going to the dogs. Start with that static population. According to the latest estimates from the Census Bureau, Vermont's population grew by only 0.1% from 2010, which is the real census, until last July. That's well behind the national rate of 3.3%. The main reason, it's not so much that more people are moving out than moving in. That's about steady, but Vermonters are not having many babies. We have one of the lowest birth rates in the country. That may be less because of what we do than because of who we are. You know who we are? We're a bunch of non-Hispanic whites. And for whatever reason, I don't want to get into the question of whether non-Hispanic whites are undersexed. That's not my area of expertise. But they are not having many babies. In fact, in the whole country, non-Hispanic whites are not replacing themselves. The population would be shrinking were it not for immigration and the birth rates of minorities. Worse, not only are we a bunch of white Anglos, we're educated white Anglos. Well, let me rephrase that. We're more likely to have graduated from college. Whether that really makes you educated is a whole separate discussion. But we, according to a financial news service, 35.7% of Vermonters over the age of 25 are college graduates. That's very high. Only in 6 states, Virginia, New Jersey, Connecticut, Maryland, Colorado, Massachusetts, is the number higher. And educated non-Hispanic whites are having even fewer children if they are affluent. Now, of course, Vermont is not an affluent state, right? Actually, wrong. Vermont is a reasonably, we're not one of the top, but we're closer to the top than the bottom, and we've been coming up. We may not have been coming up only because we're so wonderful, and we didn't used to be. We used to be poor. This was all those years when the population was declining, or at least not rising, we were among the poorest states in the Union. That's why all those capable people left here. They left here to find work. Not that people are still not leaving here to find work sometimes, but not in the numbers that they were many decades ago. Median household income was way, way behind what the figure is nationally. When I first started writing about this stuff 10 years ago, we started to creep up in the 70s. You know, we were like half. In the 40s, 50s, we were like half the median household income that the nation was. We started to creep up. When I started writing about this stuff about 10 years ago, we'd come up to 95. Now we're above. We're not very far above. In 2014, that's That's very recent. The median household income in Vermont was $52,767 a year, the 19th highest in the country. That's not at the top, but it's a little closer to the top than the bottom. Nationwide, median household income was 53,046. I'm sorry, I have that written. We're 54,767. Nationally was 53,046. Now, I think maybe we popped up above the national number less because we were doing so well than because so many other states did so poorly in the recession. We're not a boom and bust economy in Vermont. We're kind of a steady state economy. And we did not get hurt by the Great Recession as much as some other states. We didn't have nearly as big a housing bubble as the other states did in the first years of this century. So when it burst, it didn't hurt us as badly. One reason is we have some tighter financial regulation than many other states. So it was mortgage holders had some protections in Vermont that they didn't have in some states, and that kept the foreclosure rate down. We had, for almost that whole time, we had either the lowest or the second lowest foreclosure rate back in 2009 and 2010 when people were getting, homes were being foreclosed by the boatload all over the country. Another real problem we have is that whilst if you look at the aggregate figures in Vermont, we're not doing bad, but we're not doing very well everywhere. A few weeks before the legislative session ended, Senator Kevin Mullen, a Republican from Rutland, not far from here, held up a chart during a meeting of the Finance Committee. The chart showed that since the depth of the recession, June of 2009, employment in Vermont had rebounded. Except it didn't really show that. It showed that employment in Burlington had rebounded. In the rest of the state, fewer people were working last December. I think it's a little better now. Fewer people were working last December than in June of 2007. In the most rural counties, jobs are hard to find and the population is actually declining. What county are we in? Bennington. Oh, no, I think Bennington is okay, is even, not declining. I may be wrong, I didn't do all of them. Now, you have to take these statistics, estimates, with a little grain of salt, because we're talking about very, very small numbers. For instance, Orleans County, where I live, the population from 2010 to last year, or to 2013, fell by 20. That happens to be less than the margin of error in the model that estimated the decline. So we really, it could have gone up by 12 people and the model would still be right. So, but the trend doesn't look good. If you have all these counties where at least the population doesn't seem to be growing, rural Vermont is in trouble. And once again, rural Vermont is in trouble because Vermont is part of the United States of America, and rural America is in worse trouble. In fact, compared to the rest of the states, their rural areas, we're doing great. You should look at the data for rural Alabama, Texas, Nebraska, and Montana. A database of all counties in the country prepared by a map-making firm, something called Esri, I don't know anything about them, projects that 2 Vermont counties, Essex and Windsor, will continue to lose population until 2020. But follow that database for the rest of the country. Scores of counties in the Midwest and South, they're all rural, are losing not a few people a year, but 1 and 2, not a year, but every 2 and 3 years, 1 and 2 and 2.5% of their going down by that. That's a big percent to lose a county's population. Somebody's got a map of it, and if you look at it, and another reason I wish I could have done the PowerPoint, the counties that are losing the most population are in a sort of a dark purple. And you look out in the Great Plains and the rural South, and there's great big blocks of dark purple, county after county, which has been losing population for years. I mean, rural America has been losing population for years, for a century. So this is not new. And what's happening here is the same thing happening elsewhere, right? Farms are consolidating, so they're not hiring because a big farm doesn't need as many people as 3 little farms. The farmer used to, when his farm went blue, he used to go get a job at the small factory in the nearby city. Small manufacturing is more and more difficult, not just here, but everywhere. Logging, used to take, do you have much logging around here? We have a fair amount up in the Northeast Kingdom. Used to have a crew of 8 or 10 men, they were all men then, with chainsaws. One person sitting in the cab of one of these Norwegian machines can slice a tree off just about at the ground, tilt it this way, cut the branches off it, cut it into 8-foot sections, and wrap them all in cellophane quicker than those 8 guys with the chainsaws. Okay, I lied about the cellophane. They don't do cellophane. But you just don't need as many people. And the same thing is true in all manufacturing and all resource production. And this is, probably not telling you anything you don't know. This has been going on for decades. So the employment opportunities, especially for men, and especially for men who don't go to college, are declining in Vermont and in Pennsylvania and in Ohio and in Minnesota and just about everywhere. And we're actually in much better shape than, look at next door in New Hampshire. The low-tax paradise, often held up as a model by people who complain about Vermont. Poverty runs through Coos County like a river, according to Jeff Woodburn, as a state senator from that county up there in northern New Hampshire. And that county is losing population faster than any county in Vermont, by far. The latest word you hear is that Vermont has become unaffordable. And this theme is not only heard from the hardline moan and groan set. Lieutenant Governor Phil Scott, a reasonable and intelligent man, says Vermonters are suffering an affordability crisis. And this slogan is echoed by the Republicans in the legislature, most of whom are also intelligent and reasonable men and women. Last year, a headline on the Vermonter.com website read, "Why You Cannot Afford to Live in Vermont." I read that, but I can afford to live in Vermont. And the reason I know I can afford to live in Vermont is I live in Vermont. And I bet you all live in Vermont. And therefore, by definition, you can afford to live in Vermont. Everybody who lives in Vermont can afford to live in Vermont, or they wouldn't be living in Vermont. That doesn't mean that everybody can easily afford life in Vermont. But again, is there any reason to think that life in Vermont is any less affordable than it is in all other states or most other states? And the answer is maybe. There is some evidence that life in this state is a little more difficult to afford the basics than it is in most other states. All no. But we are slightly on the affluent side, but we are more than slightly on the expensive side. A study by a real estate firm called Movoto, comparing state per capita income to cost of living, found Vermont was the 8th least affordable. And this took into account the median income in the state. So it was not just what the prices are, it was also what the prices are in relation to the income. Again, this may be less because of anything we do, our government policies, our attitudes, or et cetera, than because of where it is. We're in the Northeast. 5 of the 8 states that were even less affordable were also in the Northeast. It's an expensive part of the country to live in. It may not be too evident today, but think back a few months. You remember? It gets cold up here, doesn't it? And we have to heat our homes, and the fuel comes from far away. Every time you turn up your thermostat, every time you start your car engine, not only are you spending money, you're paying some other state's taxes. West Virginians, Texans, and North Dakotans are just delighted to have us pay for their schools and highways with every gallon of oil or ton of coal we burn. We don't burn too much coal in Vermont, a little. If only maple syrup were a necessity instead of a mere delight, we could impose the same kind of fee that those Western states do on oil extraction, and then these other states would pay for our highways and schools. Alas, we have to pay for them ourselves, along, of course, with lots of federal aid. But the fact saying that we have to pay for them segues, as the TV folks say, into the real core of this dispute, because there's an obvious political agenda behind this Vermont bashing, behind the claim that the state is going broke. This doesn't make it wrong or bad. Everybody has a political agenda. It's nothing to be ashamed of. In this case, the agenda is to argue that Vermont's government spends too much, taxes too much, and regulates too much. The result, they say, is that Vermont has a poor business climate, which discourages economic activity and is therefore bad for everyone. These claims should not be casually dismissed. The people who make them are sincere, public-spirited citizens, and they're not just talking through their hats. Most of them speak from experience. They had a project in mind that they had to abandon because the Act 250 application process was too complicated or too arduous, or it was just going to take too long. They were going to develop a piece of land until someone from Natural Resources told them there was a wetland on the property, so they couldn't build there, or if they did, they'd have to create another wetland someplace else. They canceled plans to expand a business because they got grief from some state official about the safety of their plant. And so they can state truthfully that Vermont would have had more economic enterprise, more people at work paying taxes, had they been allowed to go about their business as they saw fit. Regulations do stop some enterprises from going forward. Vermont business people have real problems and some legitimate complaints. But the data, the actual evidence supporting the contention that Vermont is or is about to become a uniquely horrible place to run a business it is not. It isn't. First of all, if it's so tough to do business here, how would our median household income have grown faster than in other states? How could our job creation be faster? Somebody must be running businesses and employing people. These job gains are in the private sector that I was talking about. Almost like every place else in the country, Vermont has been either cutting public sector jobs or at best just holding steady. According to some accounts and some experts and studies, Vermont's business climate isn't bad at all. An analysis of federal figures by an outfit called Startup America, a pro-entrepreneurial group, found that Vermont had one of the highest rates of business startup in the country over the last 6 years. The state doesn't do all that well when you look at official government data, but it doesn't do that poorly either. The Small Business Administration's figures indicate Vermont is in the middle of the pack when it comes to business success and or failure. So does the decidedly pro-business Kaufman Index of Entrepreneurial Activity, and so does Fast Company magazine, which rates Vermont the 21st best state when it comes to business innovation. 21st isn't great, but it isn't bad. It's a little better than the middle. And what about taxes? Are taxes in Vermont too high? So high that they stifle investment and entrepreneurship? Maybe in some cases. Though again, if investment and entrepreneurship were so stifled, how come our income and job numbers keep going up? But the question of comparative Vermont taxes really depends on who you are. If you are most people, your state income tax payments in Vermont are on the low side. I know that may surprise some people, but they are on the low side. If your income is at the household income median, your income tax payments, 3.55% of taxable income, are lower in Vermont than in all but 14 other states. But we do have a relatively progressive tax structure. The wealthy in Vermont pay more than they would in most, not all, but most other states. Our top rate, 8.95%, doesn't kick in until you earn $405,000 or thereabouts. But the next two rates are pretty high also. So if you make a lot of money in this state, you're relatively heavily taxed. This is a bit of a problem here because two of the states that have no state income tax are our neighbor, New Hampshire, and the always tempting Florida. You hear an almost constant chorus warning against raising taxes on the wealthy or even not cutting them, because if we raise their taxes, they'll all move to Florida. You know, some people do. They don't really move. They just make that their official residence, and they spend 6 months and a day down there, or they say they do, and then they spend the rest of the time here. I know people who do that, and it's perfectly reasonable if you like Florida, and you're spending 5 months a year there anyway. It makes perfect sense to think about spending that extra month. You save whatever you save on your income taxes. But realistically, this course is open to a rather small percentage of people. You have to either be retired or have one of these positions where you can run your business from far away. And you have to have a pretty high income. I would say at least $200,000 a year. That's about 2.5% of the people of Vermont. And you know what? A lot of them don't want to live in Florida. It certainly makes no sense to live someplace 6 months and 1 day a year if you hate it, just to save a few $1,000s that at any rate are deductible from your federal taxable income. And furthermore, if you stay in Vermont the other 5.5 months a year, your property tax will go up, probably, depending, there are all sorts of variables, if it's no longer your full-time residence. I don't think that the moving to Florida thing is a major problem in this state.
Is that correct? Just
Yes, go ahead.
Florida resident.
Yeah.
And it's a common
Might ask how many people in this room are.
How many of you? Okay, a few.
It's a common misconception that to be a Florida resident, you must be in Florida 6 months.
No, I know it's more complicated than that.
Well, no, it's much simpler.
Okay.
Florida, once you declare you're a Florida resident, Florida doesn't care if you're in Florida 30 minutes. The whole thing is to be out of
Vermont.
Don't be in Vermont
Okay.
6 months in a day. Don't be in New Hampshire or wherever. That's a huge. So it's not a big deal to be a Florida resident. Just don't be a resident of some other.
Right. Okay. Thank you for the correction. You're right. Then, of course, there are property taxes, and people complain about property taxes all the time, and I think some of those complaints are justified. But you know what? We don't have the highest property taxes in the country. I know this from my own experience. Just a few months ago, I sold a house that I co-owned, actually, in New Jersey. As it happens, the assessed value of that house was almost exactly the assessed value of my house here. The property taxes were 2.5 times higher. New Jersey has just chosen to be a high property tax, low income tax state. It's one of those 14 states where if you earn the median income, your income tax is even lower than Vermont's. So that's their choice, and we make other choices. Now when I say that Vermont has a relatively progressive income tax structure, I don't mean to say that we have a progressive tax system. In fact, if a $300,000 a year person pays a smaller percentage of his or her income in state and local taxes than a $50,000 a year person, it's a fairly regressive system. It's just less regressive than most other states. Still, no matter how you slice it, compared to many other states, Vermont taxes a lot and spends a lot of money, and there are two obvious reasons for this. One is we spend a lot on education. That's so complicated, and we could spend an entire evening. I suspect you have had people come here and talk for an hour and a half about education spending. So I'm not going to go there now. That's another problem. The other reason is that when it comes to social services, we're a relatively generous state. And you know why we're a relatively generous state? Because we have chosen to be. I'm going to tell you two little anecdotes, the things that happened to me. One night in the 1980s, coming back to, I was then in Washington. If you cover politics, you go to New Hampshire a lot. Coming back from New Hampshire in Logan Airport, bad weather, long airplane delay. Walking around the airport, I run into a guy I know and like. He's a conservative Republican from New Hampshire, very active guy. He'd been part of the Reagan campaign in '76 when Reagan lost to Gerald Ford, and we'd been friendly ever since. And we did what two people who were stuck in an airport for 3 hours do. We went to the bar and had a drink. And while we're drinking, he's talking about how great everything in New Hampshire is because the economy is booming, because the taxes are low. And he said, of course, we pay a price for taxes being low. He said, our level of services is sort of low. And not entirely, and a little bit of self-deprecation and irony, because he's not a cruel man. He said, if you have a handicapped child, don't move to New Hampshire. Okay, fast forward to last November. I'm at the little supermarket in Barton, Vermont, and I ran into a guy, friend of ours, who lives a few miles away. And he said, and he just had Thanksgiving with his son and family that live in New Hampshire, and they just had a baby girl, brand new baby girl who's very beautiful, and everything about her is fine, except she's almost totally deaf. And she's going to need a lot of assistance and a lot of services. I said, gee, that's really hard. What are they going to do? He said, they're going to get the hell out of New Hampshire. Now, and they're fairly affluent people. I don't think they're rich. Now, I know a lot of nice people in New Hampshire. It's a civilized state. You don't see poor people starving on the street. I'm sure they provide services for handicapped people. But their services are skimpier than ours. At about the same time New Hampshire was doubling down on its low-tax, low-service government, Vermonters decided to take the opposite route. For instance, national advocates of good treatment for children with special needs give this state high marks. We mainstream, this was actually Jim Jeffords' bill back in the 70s. We mainstream most special ed kids. Many of them have their own full-time aide who stays with them almost all day in school. These are low-paid positions, but it adds up. Now, we can change all that. We can decide to become less generous. In fact, over the last several years, we have become somewhat less generous in order to hold down spending and avoid tax increases. But we're still more generous than most states. I suspect we'll continue to be because, in the final analysis, we'll want to be. And I think we can afford to be, if we want to. We're not rich like Connecticut or Maryland, but neither are we poor like West Virginia or Alabama. We have options. In other words, this whole subject will be and should be a matter for public debate. In this debate, I think the voices of restraint should be listened to carefully, because restraint in and of itself is a virtue. And the people who say, let's do a little less, may have a good point vis-a-vis the people who say, let's do a little more. I'd give them a little political advice, though. They would be more effective if they stopped saying, Vermont is going broke because I will now end the suspense. It is not. Thank you very much.